Hi, Tim Snyder.
Hi there. How are you?
I'm really well. How are you?
Well, what a day and what a place to be right now. Port Townsend, Boat
Yeah,
Festival time.
indeed. We have swelled our studio audience by one more. I don't usually have this big an audience here. But Tom Hall is on one side of the room, and Lorraine, I think an associate of Mr. Snyder, is in the other corner. I guess sort of like a boxing match, maybe. And so, welcome, Lorraine. Nice to have company. So, Tim, you and I go back a ways to the very first Wooden Boat Festival.
Absolutely.
And you say you remember the interview that I did of you.
I do.
I don't. I remember that it happened, and I remember that it was recorded. And unfortunately, it was not among the couple dozen.
Archives?
Yeah, I have. Well, the Crab Radio went off the air, and a lot of the archives went away, but I took some home, and this was not among them. So I don't have that to fall back on.
Well, I'm grateful.
I'm not. I'm sad, actually. What did we talk about? What was it like then, our conversation? And if you could move a little closer to the microphone,
I can do that.
that's how you can do it.
There we are. I've tried to move the mast here and it didn't want to go. I'm always before the mast somehow. And we're talking about what it was like in 1977, and I phoned up Crab and said, we're going to be doing this boat festival in Port Townsend, and then perhaps your listeners would like to know something. And somebody smart said, well, let me see if we can get you to talk to Phil Andrus. And so I did, and I came in with my partner, Sam Connor, and we had a wonderful visit. And I think we got you inspired enough to sell your townhouse there in Seattle and pack your boat and move up here.
All 6,000 square feet. Yeah, I just sold it in a matter of minutes. The first festival, and I have in my mind that I call you the co-founder. On the phone, you disagreed with me. And you can say why you disagree, but it was the presence people that I spoke with. It was you and Sam Connor.
Right. Well, we needed a place to have it. And I think what I said is that perhaps I was just lucky enough to be the spark plug at that period of time. The boat festival was something that was bound to happen. In 1974, I'd helped start a little magazine in Maine called Wooden Boat that became fantastically successful, though perhaps not lucrative. And we went to boat shows, and at boat shows, particularly beginning at the Newport Boat Show in Rhode Island, people had never seen this magazine before, and we were printing it on our own dime, and so we were really happy when somebody bought one. The diversity of people who were interested in the topic was amazing, and the stories that people told were amazing. And then that kind of became my job, to go up and down both coasts, bringing the magazine to boating communities and boat shops and bookstores in towns that had a marine presence. And people suddenly saw that there was this magazine, and then we started hearing more stories, getting calls and letters. And then in the next year, we're at Newport, and we're at Annapolis, and then we started coming to Vancouver for their boat show. And people would come with desperate stories of, gosh, I've got this and that vessel, and it's in this and that condition, and how do you do so-and-so, and what should I use to caulk the deck, and things like that. There was this need. We saw the magazine at that time as being a book of boat restoration and handling and all of the aspects of the marine trade for maintenance of a boat, in which each issue was in fact a chapter of a book we were going continually. But there was no chance to have a seminar with people, to get people together who knew things with people who didn't. And I felt that very strongly, and I'd been a teacher and everything else, and I really felt the need for some instructional time. And I started asking people, what do you think about the idea of a show that was just wooden boats, and we could get tradesmen and sailmakers and all kinds of trades together for the people who own boats or were interested in boats. And everybody thought it was a great idea, but don't do it in my yard.
People didn't want it? Communities didn't want a festival like that?
Well, at the time, Phil, we were suspect because we had long hair.
I was going to say, could I ask? This is how I ask people this question. I ask people, Could you ever been mistaken for a hippie?
I don't know where those pictures came from me in funny wire glasses and with long hair and a beard.
So that did
You know.
maybe put some people off.
So it did, or they had their own calendar. And, it was the annual weekend for the March of Dimes parade or something in that harbor. And the big harbors, Annapolis and Newport and whatnot, were already committed to things like that. But I started writing up my ideas and sort of kind of idea about what it would be and what it would be like and the complete idea of the topic. And in 1976, I asked Mystic Seaport, which seemed to me natural, since they are the premier American maritime museum. It has wonderful vessels. They have the last whaling ship. They have a Gloucester schooner. They have all the Herreshoff boats, wonderful staff. Amazing place. I'll give a plug for them. If you have an opportunity, visit Mystic Seaport. But when I asked them, they kind of got nervous and said, well, I'm not sure we want all those sorts of people here.
Yeah, I'm thinking of rock festivals and other kinds of festivals that were going on at the time. I can imagine that looking at Tim with longer hair than he has today and considerably more of it.
And
as
more,
well.
yes.
I was going to say that they might have been nervous and might not have understood what the potential was.
Yeah, and even though coming from the heritage of Wooden Boat Magazine, where we were really doing something well, Mystic was terribly scared, and I found that unfortunate, since the revenue is generated by visitors, and suddenly they're telling me we don't want all those kinds of visitors. Then the other thing, Phil, was, and I think we touched on this when we talked 40 years ago, was that in that era of the 70s, people were questioning all kinds of social norms. And people were living on farms and growing their own vegetables. And there was a focus on doing something different, which was perhaps called the alternative culture. And an offshoot of that was people saying, well, why not the sea? And those of us with a lot of energy and some inspiration and no money could look around any boatyard and see some wonderful old vessel that looked charming and romantic, and not have the knowledge to know that we didn't have the money to play with it. And so there was this beginning emphasis on looking in the boatyards. And we heard terrible stories of wonderful vessels that were sitting there for 3 years, and even though it was a wonderful vessel, maybe made by Herreshoff or somebody else famous, on the east and west coast, they were being chainsawed and destroyed. So there was a feeling of wanting to do something about these great boats. There was a feeling about getting the knowledge out and having one little harbor talk to the next harbor and people sharing skills. There was a real impetus for it. And Phil, we were only 8 years after Woodstock. So, and who knew? I mean, did Max Yaris know what was going to happen when he said people could have a concert on his farm? They didn't know. Well, when I came out here at the West Coast, and again I was going from San Francisco to Vancouver looking at boatyards and places where people use boats, there was tremendous interest in it. And there was actually a little show in the spring of '77 after I just came from Vancouver in Anacortes. And Anacortes at the time was a hotbed of their community in wooden boat building. There were actually some wooden boat builders there. There's some great marine chandleries and things like that, and working fish boats being repaired. There was real feeling there of honesty in boat building, and I discussed my ideas, and they were all for it. Their idea was, yeah, let's do it here. And one of the people of that show was Sam Connor, who I had corresponded with and spoke to in the past at Wooden Boat Magazine, and I was interested in what he was building and what he was doing and what was going on in Port Townsend. And he cautioned me not to sign on with Anacortes until I'd seen Port Townsend. And he brought me over here and told me to come. And I drove my Volkswagen bus full of magazines and T-shirts down and ran on this wonderful antique ferry that we used to have until the Department of Transportation took them away. And the city of Port Townsend appeared at the foot of the mountains, looking like a West Coast Nantucket. and there was Point Hudson, and I knew I'd found the place. And Sam said, please, let's do it in my shop, and I'll give you all the help I can, and I'll introduce you to the locals. And it sort of became a people event that I had the idea for, I had the contacts, I had the desk, and I had the telephone. And for 4 months, I wrote and called and gave people the idea, and it went out on the coconut grapevine. And we expected 800 people max, and 3,000 came. We were dumbfounded. So was the town.
Were you ready for 3,000?
Well,
how many porta potties did you have?
Did we have porta potties is a good question. Yes, we had porta potties. And thankfully, we had Tyvek Mike, who had been running security for Bumbershoot and has the little house on the other side of the lagoon. And he knew how to do a large event, so having more people was no sweat. And he kept things in line, kept things orderly. And we're talking about a gathering of people who were boat craftsmen and friends of boat craftsmen and sailmakers and things like that. It was people who were hungry to see what was going on with other people and to ask questions and have demonstrations and to get involved in making this a reality for their lives.
So I need to tell people that I'm talking to Tim Snyder, whom I call a co-founder of the Wooden Boat Festival. I'm Phil Andrus. This is Toss Salad on KPTZ. Rowley, at that point, managed, they had the lease for Point Hudson. What were they like to work with?
George Rowley was a story in himself, and many people may remember stories. He actually had an interesting larger wooden boat, a cruiser, that Sam had worked on. And because Sam had worked on it, he was able to persuade George that he should kick everybody out of the marina who were paying Rowley to be there for a weekend and let us hippies play there. It was remarkable, and so that's what happened there, and we did.
Do you remember what you had to pay for the facility for the weekend?
You know, it might have been $500.
It might have been next to nothing.
Yeah, well, that was then. You know, $500 would buy you a pretty good used car. You know, and
how much was admission, or did you charge admission?
Well,
or were you able to collect admission? Security has been an issue over the years.
Well, it wasn't an issue in that, Phil, we wanted this to be a serious thing and to answer the needs of people who were concerned with the trades and learning and whatnot. And so we put it out and had people write in. And the people who wrote in, we said, and I think it was $26 or something like that for 3 days. And we got all those names, and we typed out badges and gave people badges so that people could talk to people, and I could know that I was talking to Phil if I forgot that you were the guy in the red shirt. And so it was people to people talking, and that money that they paid in, and yes, there was a gate, and people could buy a daily ticket, but predominantly it was the getting the people together and the stories of people getting in their Volkswagen in Maine and driving to Port Townsend. You know, I had to come. It was, I suppose, and people have said, it was the Woodstock of wooden boats. And it was just remarkable. And there were all of those incredible stories that happened. And
who were some of the first presenters?
Well, I think that when I said I was a spark plug, I think that was an ability I had, because I was cognizant and knew many of the great people of the trade from other boat shows or from the magazine. So I was able to bring Lance Lee, who had started the apprentice shop in Maine and was a crusader for wooden boats and wooden boat trades. And so he was very dynamic, and it went on. And then there were some other people who have to be mentioned. There was Van and Patty. Did you know Van and Patty?
I did.
Well, I mean, he was the grandfather.
Van Hope.
Van Hope was the dean of boat building here, and he inspired all of us who wanted to do things. And his wife Patty could sew sails and do all these kinds of things. They had this beautiful little boat that they built themselves, and they subsequently sailed to Hawaii, and they were just so impressive. The other person I had known, through the magazine, was Spike Africa.
I was going to ask about him, and he was a character and a half.
Spike was amazing. He was just amazing, and he had a title that was given to him by people on the West Coast as president of the Pacific Ocean. And he had been the skipper for Sterling Hayden's schooner when he stole his children. Hayden stole his children back from the ex-wife and put them on the schooner in the middle of the night and sailed off to Tahiti. And Spike's kids had grown up on the schooner with Hayden's children, and includes Kid Africa, who is quite a remarkable person here in our boating scene today. So that was kind of amazing. And there's another local kind of fun thing, and that is that I don't know why, but a fellow who was making pastry down at Pioneer Square, Brian Toss, decided to come up here for the weekend. And he saw Spike tying knots, and he fell in love with the trade. And he's now a rigger who rigs boats and writes books on knots and everything else, inspired by Spike. And I think that if I feel anything wonderful about the festival, I felt many wonderful things, but one of the things I can point to is looking back and seeing that people were inspired to go ahead with their dreams and really do wonderful things they might not have normally have done because of that gathering.
In 1977, right?
In 77, yeah.
Was Port Townsend already becoming a place for wooden boats, for commercial restorations, for fishing boats, I mean? Was there much going on in wooden boats in Port Townsend? That was a little before my time, so I don't know.
Well, yes, but Phil, I'm really lucky to have an educated host here asking me smart questions that are easy for me to answer.
Let's hear the answer then, Tim.
Yes, there were.
Mark Byrne was here already?
Mark Byrne was here, and Michael Aubin, and those folks who had training, really severe professional training, and they were restoring fish boats, and there were other people restoring fish boats here. Skookum was making a fiberglass boat, but a very solid, seaworthy boat, and there were a cadre of very professional boat builders doing woodwork for those boats, and those things were happening. The other side of the coin, Phil, was that Port Townsend was very inexpensive then. Because the railroad never came in 1894, and all the money pulled out of Port Townsend, this was virtually a ghost town into the 70s, where you could live very inexpensively and buy a house very inexpensively. And people in the maritime trades will tell you how poor they are, because it's not a way to make money. It's a wonderful, beautiful passion, but making money is very difficult. And so you could live here cheaply and get involved in the trade and pick things up. And so that happened. Also, one of the people who was very influential was Earl Wakefield. Earl Wakefield was the dean of boat building at Seattle Community College and had taught generations of people boat building, and I saw his work and knew people, students down there. And Earl came up here. He loved what he saw that we were doing. He connected with the idea of teaching and showing his trades. Sam knew some other people. Joe Trumbley. I went down to Bates. Is it Bates in Tacoma?
It is indeed Bates, yes.
Yeah, and he was doing a famous boat building class there. So when these people came and they brought everybody they knew and whatnot, it just went like Topsy. And created the same sense of excitement, this Woodstock kind of excitement that we had.
So most of the wooden boat scene at that time, I think, was fishing boats, mostly trollers. I think it was a lot of what I will say is mistaken for hippie hand trollers, who were hand trollers in Alaska, who had gone to Alaska and gotten a rowboat and a permit, and had then graduated to real boats.
Well, that's right.
And they were bringing them to Port Townsend to have, because they were real wooden boats that were long neglected. It needed a great deal of work. That's what happened with Port Townsend.
Were you thinking of the Eileen Farrell?
Oh, the Eileen. Well, yeah, Eileen is an interesting story. I connect with Eileen personally somewhat.
Yeah.
But many others, actually. The boats that I worked on as an electrician.
Absolutely.
Boats that they were what those folks could afford, who started with a rowboat and a hand troll permit and managed to get enough salmon in the hold of their rowboat to buy a power troll permit and a wooden boat that may have been on the beach for a while.
Absolutely.
And brought it into Mark Burns, and Mark and his crew had, and Michael Aubin, for example,
Right.
Ernie Baird had to make them into boats that would float and fish.
Absolutely. And those people were very important. And for our community, they were very important to the wooden boat movement that we established here. There was also here a few choice examples of fine boat building in terms of the Alcyone, Bertram Levy's boats, boats that were built with great care as interesting traditional boats. Let me just touch on one other thing, and that was the other thing that had happened in our society in that period was that historically boats were built by someone for someone, and it was built to do a job. And so we've had a history around the world of somebody building a boat just for somebody who could do something in Southeast Asia to get the crop that they were used to getting. On the East Coast or the West Coast, there were boats that were specifically built for a use. But there was a handcraft. It was a handcrafted boat that somebody built. Anything built by hand then and now is more expensive than the average Joe can afford. So boats became, as a product of World War II, when they saw how they could mass-produce airplanes, they started producing boats in factories, some of which were still wood, but they're also using new materials of aluminum and fiberglass. So there was a whole wash of boats that came into everybody's use that were not wood, leaving this legacy of wooden boats on the side, but yet people who still love them in Lake Union and so many places had examples of boats. And what struck me was that in the east, you have to pull your boat because the water freezes for the winter. In here, in the west, from San Francisco north, there are amazing boats, some who are quite old, that since they're not subjected to ice and snow and they're kept out of the sun, they last. And so there was greater diversity here than I had seen in any small area of the east. There was more boating population in the Puget Sound than almost any other area of the United States. So there was tremendous interest, and still is tremendous interest in boating.
So the boats that first came, you have, I think, been down to Point Hudson in the last day or two. Do you see any boats that were with you the first year?
Absolutely.
And their names?
Absolutely. Now, that's hard. I've got to look at my cheat sheet here in the program.
But there are a few from 30-some years ago.
Well,
37 years ago.
From 37 years ago. And the Virginia 5 is here. And Adventurous is here. You know, some really significant boats would be significant anywhere in the nation for the tradition of what they have and the quality of boats that they represent. The Virginia 5, the last of the Mosquito fleet, is over 100 feet, over 100 years long, 100 feet long, 100 years old, has 3 decks, a triple compound steam engine, and has been known by generations of people here in the Northwest as the thing that took the Boy Scout troop out, or, had a cruise to support the symphony or whatnot. And so for 100 years, the population here has known that boat. And then to have that boat here blowing its steam whistle, this last historic vessel, and it can't quite afford to come every year. So I'd like your people just to write checks to the Virginia 5 and send them off today.
I wonder what they burn for fuel. Diesel, I suppose, for their steam engine still?
A bunker.
You think so?
I think it's an oil-fired
Really a
steam.
heavy fuel then, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, but they're not like, there's nobody in there shoveling coal.
No.
Nobody chucking firewood into the burner.
Yeah.
It's something that flows, a liquid of a sort, huh?
And the Adventurous, again, is just a boat that so many people knew from Boy Scout trips or for other things. Adventurous is this incredible 100-plus foot schooner that was built for the Arctic trade and didn't happen and ended up being here. Just an amazing vessel. There's so many great stories down there, and I recommend for people to go walk the docks and to read the placards on some of the boats. And I was astounded last night at the opulence of some Trumpy yachts that must be worth $2 million, a 3-foot wooden vessel built 40 years ago that is like brand new. And then counterposed with that is a teenage woman with a little sailboat built in 1937, and it's an Ed Monk Sr. design. And she and her other sister spend their waking moments keeping this boat and restoring this boat. And I can see that the dream is going to continue and stay alive.
So, Tim, I want to back up a long ways. You were associated with Wooden Boat Magazine at the beginnings of the festival here, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Were you involved in the establishment of the Wooden Boat Magazine?
Absolutely.
Really, you were, huh?
Absolutely.
And before that, what were you doing?
Well,
where were you raised?
I was raised in Connecticut, and we had old boats. So I grew up with this tradition of old boats. My father, whose shop in New York was full of cabinet makers and fine wood and whatnot, thought I should get an opportunity to be on the sea. And he went down to Sparkman's and Stevens and bought from Olin Stevens the plans for a Blue Jay, which was a very popular boat class starting then, of a small training boat, safe for children, but yet something which handled well. And he bought the plans of Blue Jay that now number in tens of thousands of Blue Jays out there sailing.
And you say your father was a cabinet maker?
He was more than that, but he designed furniture that he had European craftsmen build, but he had the physical skills to do any kind of woodworking. So we built this Blue Jay. I helped him as a wee lad, and it's number 139.
Where is she now?
In Connecticut, still sailing.
With your family?
And I just turned it over to a fellow who was a wood craftsman who wanted to have the dream of sailing that again every day.
And a wee lad was how old for you at that time?
Oh, me, I was 6, 7.
Uh-huh.
But old enough to be able to sand a piece of wood that I was handed or something and do that sort of stuff. So there were those wonderful traditions that I've been involved in, and I saw in that time wonderful boats that I can see again. When you go down to the festival, I saw a Matthews there last night. That was, it was the classic Buick for a successful family in the 40s and 50s, and there was one actually owned by Joe Euro here in town. Again, resplendent, another era, still here.
Do you have a boat, Tim?
Well,
you just gave away the Blue Jay.
No, I'm from New England. I had sold it.
Excuse me. Question remains.
Yes.
Do you have a boat?
And I have I'm down to just a bunch of little boats that sit in the yard, and I've got a Norwegian Rana boat sitting on a trailer that is almost firewood now at this point. And if somebody's listening and they want a Norwegian Rana boat, come on over and let's make a deal.
So I remember from your background, I think I remember correctly, that somehow or other you went to the London School of Economics.
Well, I did.
How does this fit in, Tim?
Well, our education is an amalgam of all the experiences we've had. And I was lucky enough to go over there and see that, and to begin to get an idea of English boating traditions, and to see some of the great yards there. And I haven't been able to turn it loose. In 1980, I found myself wandering around Southeast Asia, thankfully not in a uniform, but able to see indigenous boat building and to take pictures of people building different things out of teak on the beach, and to be able to bring that together and do a slideshow that I've shown at some maritime museums in the East, and again to see the spirit of it. There's now a wooden boat show in France, and the funny one, Phil, is that Mystic Seaport, who didn't want us back when we were hippies, now has a very luxurious wooden boat show every June, where Port Townsend is represented by Eden Sawwoods and perhaps some other people.
Very interesting. And I was going to ask you the matter of the community looking askance at you. And for the first few years, I recall there being some question about whether next year's festival was even going to be welcomed. What changed? Because obviously this is a big deal in Port Townsend now. It's maybe the biggest deal of the year.
I think it is.
and obviously it's welcome. I gather it's not so welcome on Water Street because apparently Wooden Boat Festival people take parking places and don't spend a lot of money, but still it brings a lot of money to the community.
Absolutely.
At some point, the community realized, well, I guess I'll say they were sitting on a gold-plated boat.
I'll accept that, Phil. And yeah, what happened is that the initial thing I was told was you can have your festival, but don't get in any trouble and don't let it cost us any money. And so we were able to cover the costs of the festival. Then the next year we expected another 3,000 and 10,000 came. And each time the town was sold out of food, sold out of beer, sold out of motel rooms. And all of a sudden the Chamber of Commerce is coming to me and saying, Tim, please come out and be a member of the Chamber of Commerce. And the more the Chamber of Commerce saw that this thing was this boom, the economic boom, the more they wanted to be involved, and so they became more involved. And many of us who'd been there at the beginning suddenly went off to do other things, and so now you have this huge festival that's done very well. But I don't know if we have the same emphasis on tradesmen exchanging secrets and showing other people. It's a wonderful festival now, but they make an enormous amount of money on T-shirts and beer. And in our first festivals, we forgot to sell beer. We forgot to have T-shirts. We were so busy seeing if there was somebody who could carve a mast like Bruce Tipton.
It's really interesting, too, the people that have been around here so long, and Bruce is another one.
Bruce is another one.
And people are pretty quiet about it, pretty quiet about the work that they can do. And it's not just in the marine trades, actually. It's in instrument making. The Leader had an article about instrument makers, but just the makers of violin bows. There's a couple, three people here in Port Townsend who are among the world's most illustrious makers of violin bows.
Absolutely.
And who would know?
Absolutely.
Who would know who they are, where they work, who they sell to, that they even exist. And it's also true, maybe not quite so true in the marine trades, but it's somewhat true as well.
Oh. It's just, aren't we lucky? We have this renaissance of craft that gives us some quality in our lives to augment the encroachment of highways and big box stores and Walmarts and Rite Aids that you see.
We're talking. Those are profanities here, I think. For how many years were you involved in organizing the festival?
I was the coordinator of the original two festivals. I was the founding director of the Wooden Boat Foundation. I took the forms in my checkbook to Olympia so that there could be a Wooden Boat Foundation, and then it changed and became more a different focus and with different people who have carried on. But Phil, I think I can say that it's like having a child that you think you want to develop in a certain way, and it develops another way. And you now see the adult, and you're very pleased at how the adult has grown and become, especially if they haven't written home for checks.
So had you been a single parent and stayed with the project all these 37 years, how do you think it might be different?
Oh, I think it'd be very much the same. One year I put on a university of boat building and hired Fort Worden and had people come to a symposium, and that was an amazing thing with faculty from all over the United States and people from all over the United States. But again, the movement has broadened and it has become, well, look at the Wooden Boat School. Look at these great things that are now happening that never existed before.
And what are you doing with yourself these days?
Well, I'm trying to maintain a Victorian house, and I'm frequently writing angry letters to some editor or senator about abuses that I see happening in our society. So I'm chewing my tongue about things.
And you moved away for a while.
Well, sometimes I go back to New England. I have to be cold and see snow and put wood in a wood stove. yeah, and that's, and see some of the same things. I keep those same contacts from all of those years in many of those things. I've been a member of Mystic Seaport for over 40 years, and so I'm still visiting all of those same things and keeping track and being educated by all the things that people are doing places.
So I like anecdotes, and I'm going to ask you for a couple from the first festival or two, and they would fall into the category of, oh my God, what are we going to do now? The surprises that weren't the surprises you were hoping for, other than 5 times more people than you expected.
Oh my God! You didn't warn me about that, Phil. I haven't prepared any material. I've got to look at my notes here. No, I can tell you some things. One was that business about the fact that we didn't even think about having T-shirts, and Bruce Tipton looked around and went, "There's no T-shirts." And he wisely went down to J.C. Penney and bought all the blank T-shirts he could. He devised a cunning little drawing that he put on a block print, and he went back to his house and he printed up T-shirts, and he stood out selling T-shirts. And
well, I would think those would be quite valuable now. I don't remember what they look like, but man, if somebody has one of those, they have a special item. I wear out my T-shirts.
I know. Well, the modern washers are just so rough on great old cotton.
Mm-hmm. Did the police have to come for anything?
Well, one time...
Because Bob Hinton, I think, was police chief then, wasn't he? Hard to remember.
Bob Hinton was both a sheriff and he was a cop. And I'm trying to remember, you did... There was a fellow who was a really nice... police chief back in the 70s, and we were trying to establish a school for boat building and had boat building classes after the first festival when we had the Wooden Boat Foundation, and wanted to get national funding and get grants to carry it on. And I was corresponding with our senator, Scoop Jackson's office, and they wrote back, and Scoop Jackson was happy with the idea, because his uncle had been a boat builder, and he came for a rally and was having breakfast at the Surf, and his aide told us that, and he said he might like to see our thing. So we went down and kidnapped the senator, and didn't think anything of it, and put him in the back of a 54 Chevrolet and drove him down to see the boat shop. And he was having a great time and forgot to show up at the high school. All of a sudden, the police car comes down and goes, "Have you seen our senator? One of the most important men in America." And we had shanghaied him.
Good work, Tim. Very good work. Another supporter, actually contemporary and a senator, is Patty Murray.
Really?
And she supports generally the marine trades here in town.
Yeah.
Her son, I believe her son, is involved in marine trade somewhat.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Tim Snyder, thank you a lot. It's always fun to talk with you. Last time we talked was at the airport, because you're a pilot, too.
Yes, with a fabric airplane and a wooden propeller, which is another project if anybody wants to get involved in that one.
So you ever think about starting some other kind of festival, maybe for old airplanes?
I just enjoy going to things now, that I don't have to sit up at 3 a.m. and worry about whether they're going to go on and whether the guy who promised to cook clams is going to show up.
Very well. Lorraine, is there anything we've left out that you think I should have asked him? Do I have your name right? I wrote it down.
Yeah,
it is Lorraine. Yep.
No, I'm just happy that Tim's getting a chance to talk about this and get the recognition that he really deserves.
And Lorraine's off mic, but she said she's happy to be here and happy Tim is here, and so am I. And
Thank
we'll
you,
see you
Phil.
again maybe next year, but I hope before.
That'd be great.